So let's start off. I thought let's talk a little bit about the current situation that we all face, and then we may end up there, but in between we may meander on all sorts of different avenues. But the first question I've been asking all our guests is, an awful lot of people are describing what's going on with COVID at the moment as a war, an analogy that seems to fit for some people. But as someone like yourself who's actually witnessed war at close hands, is this the right analogy for the current circumstances that we find ourselves in?
I mean, I'm not sure that in any other circumstances other than a war, you would be able to mobilize the nation or nations in the way that you've seen in recent weeks. Certainly you couldn't have introduced the restrictions on movement, but neither could you have done the many positive things that have taken place, for example, in the NHS, where the kind of bureaucracy, the legacy of underfunding, for example, all of these things were sort of tackled in an incredibly short space of time to begin to create a medical system that was fit for purpose, fit for dealing with the pandemic. Now, that can only happen in a sort of war-style situation. Where I'm slightly less comfortable with the notion of us fighting a war is just the kind of militaristic undertones, because let's not forget, this is about saving lives, not destroying lives. That's the fundamental, absolute difference. And it's been brought home to me so forcefully in the last week or more when I've been filming in some London hospitals and seeing the extraordinary work being done at every level. And yes, you do, I suppose, have what you would call a kind of army of people with very different skills who are taking part in this, you know, from consultants to nurses, to ambulance staff, to porters, to cleaners, to cooks, all of the people who make up this incredible response that's taking place to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was reflecting, I actually did a piece to camera in one of the wards the other day, and during it, I said, you know, I have been in war zones, and obviously this is different because I'm in a hospital that's far better resourced than most of those that I'm used to dealing with. But the thing that struck me, the sort of where the comparison was valid in terms of medical staff, is this extraordinary sense of common purpose that I've come across. It really is something to behold. And medical professionals out there listening to me will know that, in spite of the frustrations that they face in different parts of the country around issues like PPE, in spite of the heartbreak of seeing colleagues become sick and in some cases die, that sense of unity, of knowing that there is this enemy out there which can't be seen, but whose effects are so profound and tragic, potentially tragic. The knowledge that you're fighting that, and you're doing it. Look, you know, think about Thursday night clap for carers. The idea that the nation has come behind people in this way, and not in a jingoistic way. That's the other big difference with the war thing. You know, there's no jingoism. What there is this amazing affection for the people who are carrying out this struggle.
It is very difficult to avoid analogies, though, isn't it? I mean, you just talked about the enemy we're facing, and I'm about to ask you, have you actually been on what we would call the front line, as it were? Have you been on a COVID ward and had to wear all the gear?
I don't want to give away too much before our broadcast.
Fair enough.
but I certainly can say that I have been close to the phenomenal work being done, and very close to the bravery of the people who face those dangers every day, who face what it means to go into an environment where there are aerosols which are potentially lethal contamination, and who do that day in, day out. I spoke to a young doctor yesterday. He said, well, look, he said, yes, of course, it's a challenge for somebody like me. He said, but doctors tend to pop in and out. He said, it's the nurses who are in there, for a full shift, who really have his admiration. But I admired everybody I came across. I mean, I was looking at, the cleaner who's there taking out potentially contaminated waste. The volunteers that I saw yesterday at a London hospital queuing up to bring in the pizzas and the food that they'd collected from different parts of town. Just so many people. And I think you notice it more in a city that's as empty as London is at the moment. You really think the people who are doing the good stuff stand out.
And I mean, to be fair to the Prime Minister, I thought he caught that very well in what he said when he came out to St Thomas's, as well as pointing out what everyone in the medical profession knows, that everyone at St Thomas is called Nick. don't know how he picked that up, but it's absolutely right.
And the other thing is, it's the United Nations in terms of the kind of ethnicities and backgrounds of the people who are confronting this here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and
there are people from everywhere doing this, and you realise just how important to the NHS those people who have come from abroad, and whether that's Europe or whether it's as far away as the Philippines or India, just how critical they are, how the system could not cope without their input.
Well, you're preaching to the converted, and many of the people watching you are health professionals who I don't think will need reminding of that, but it is still good to say that. So, okay, let's go back to you and let's start at the beginning. As you said in one of your more recent books, it's all about family. It always is. So your family background, your family comes from, I may be pronouncing it, Listowel. Is that, how do we pronounce that?
Listowel. You made a good, Listowel. You took a good shot at it.
Not bad, not bad. Okay. Which I know is in County Kerry. And you come from a strong Irish literary background. Your uncle was a very famous playwright. You know, his statue is in Listowel. And your father, Eamon, was a well-known actor. And you come back, your most recent book, Wounds, a story of, well, I've got it here actually, arrived today, courtesy of Amazon. A story, you tell me what it's a story of now, a memoir of war and love. A memoir of war and love is about your family, and it focuses on a particular period in Irish history. All of us are familiar with the Easter Rising and the terrible beauty and all that. But this is what comes next, a much more darker time, and how that impacted on your family. So do you want to start off the story with perhaps with your grandmother, or where you think that story begins?
I grew up, surrounded by memories of war, but they were notable for their vagueness. And so, we were a family who drew in big pictures and in shades. And so I would be told that my grandmother had done very dangerous things. I was told that she'd been under a death sentence by the Black and Tans. It was the sort of irregular paramilitary police force that came into Ireland during the period of the 1920 to 22 Troubles. Yep. And it was, as I say, notable for vagueness, except for the suggestion that it had all been very heroic. The older I got, the more I sort of delved into Irish history. I knew it couldn't have been as clean and heroic as was described to me. And then once I became a sort of war correspondent and began to cover civil wars, ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts in different parts of the world, I began to look back at our own conflict with a much more skeptical eye. And I wanted to know what my own people had done. I wanted to know, I suppose, what it was that set me on the road to being a war correspondent, to being somebody who was obsessed with those wars of identity, with that question, why am I willing to kill you because of who I think you are? Not because of who you are, but who I think you are. And that took me back into family history. And it's a book I suppose I wrote comparatively late in my writing career. I mean, I'm in my late 50s now. It was in my mid 50s when I began to research this book. But I think it took that time before I was ready, and I think before Ireland was ready. And one of the remarkable things that happened was that the government began to release the archive records of people like my grandmother, their pension applications. And in those pension applications, people had to state what they did. Now, of course, there was a great deal of obfuscation. There was a sort of playing down of the less honorable and less pleasant parts of the past. But there was still enough information in there for me to be able to go on the trail of my grandmother, of her brother Mick, who was a leading member of one of the IRA flying columns. They were one of the hit and run ambush squads in North Kerry. And in particular, around a couple of local killings that had taken place of policemen and a retired policeman. And activities that my ancestors had been involved in, but about which they had maintained complete silence when I was growing up as a child. And so as I go back to what I said at the beginning, I was told about the heroic struggle against the Black and Tans, my grandmother being put under a death sentence, but I didn't hear about how friends of my family had walked up behind a policeman on the main street in Listowel and blown his brains out. Nor did I hear about how they had abducted a retired policeman who was suspected of being an informer and taken him across the hills and executed him on a beautiful spring morning. And he left behind a letter to his family, which is one of the most poignant things that I've ever read in any war, in which he says to them, don't go to the trouble of having a wake. Don't let there be a big mass. Because he was conscious, this man about to die, of the shame that was going to come on his family because he was being executed as an informer. So that was it. It was the thing that I've tried to go after in my journalistic life, which is the painful truths, the intimate truths.
And to be clear, this is not a colonial struggle, is it? This is the police officer who was murdered.
Well, it is.
Was an Irishman.
He is. I mean, but many colonial struggles have been waged against. I mean, if you look at South Africa, the struggle against white rule in South Africa, or indeed in many other parts of the world, the kind of imperial force has very frequently used local, locals to do the fighting for them. That's one of the most tragic parts of those kind of savage wars of peace, as Alistair Horn described his book about
Algeria, isn't it? Yeah.
Is the and that's what it's what adds an incredible bitterness to the exchanges. And of course, we come out of that war of independence, as we call it, the Anglo-Irish War is what the British call it, and into the Civil War. And things happen in that, which the Irish government, the new Free State government, does things which the British could never have gotten away with. Executions on a scale that the British couldn't have carried off.
You have some fairly appalling atrocities that you describe in Kerry during that time.
Indeed, Kerry was incredibly bitter, and they sent a regiment from Dublin called the Dublin Guards, and whose job was to sort of clean up Kerry and stop the kind of revolution against the new Irish state. And one of the things they did was to tie a group of IRA prisoners, IRA suspects, to a landmine and blow them to pieces. And that happened in a couple of other places as well. That was in retaliation for IRA attacks on the Free State Army. And one of the images which sticks in my head, and as I say, as a veteran of covering many wars, the brutality of this, the cruelty of this. At one point, relatives come to the army barracks to reclaim the remains of those who've been blown up by the landmine. And the army band is sent out and it plays the Sheik of Araby to taunt them. And that was a particularly local nastiness. It was, and the kind of thing that was guaranteed to live on in the memory.
And how is that now commemorated or dealt with in modern Ireland? I mean, we have the anniversary of the Easter Rising, in a way, but partly because of our British appalling behaviour afterwards. But is an easy to grasp story. But a civil war is never easy to grasp.
No, it's not, and nor is the kind of struggle you described during the War of Independence, where Irishmen in the service of the British Crown fought against other Irishmen. These things are very difficult to remember, and it's a huge debate in Ireland now. You'll recall recently that there was uproar when it was suggested that the Royal Irish Constabulary should be commemorated. Now, I had a great-grandfather who was a policeman. He was a sergeant in the Royal Irish Constabulary. He served the Crown because he believed in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, that the British Empire was immutable. It wasn't going to go anywhere. And that the best future for Ireland was as a devolved, self-governing nation, but within the British Empire. His son, Patrick Hassett, my mother's father, believed differently and ended up joining the IRA. So within that one family, you had that sundering around a very fundamental political question, a question of identity. Am I British or am I Irish? And that question has come up again. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to find the form of ceremonies, and particularly the kind of words that are needed to make it what it needs to be. And that is an honest and mature reflection on what we did to each other.
How was your book received in Ireland itself?
Very well. I mean, if sales are anything to go by, it did.
That's a good start.
I mean, it depends, I was very nervous. I'll never forget the night of the launch down in Listowel. So, this is my family's hometown. I went back to the place where these events had happened. And, memories run deep in that part of the world. And I was standing with the grandson of one of the assassins of the policeman. Tobias O'Sullivan is the policeman who's assassinated. was at the center of the book. And I was standing with the grandson of one of the assassins, when a man came up to us and said, look, I'm not from around here, but I am a great grandson of Tobias O'Sullivan, the policeman. And so in that moment, you had the direct descendant of one of the assassins and the direct descendant of the man who was assassinated standing next to each other. And I said, gentlemen, I think you may have words to say to each other, and I'm going to leave you in peace to do it. And I walked away and I left them. And there was the most wonderful, civilized, open-hearted conversation that both reported to me afterwards. And I think that set the tone. I think that at that time, there was a real sense of people wanting to find an accommodation. Now, one of the things that happened in the meantime is that the situation in the north of Ireland deteriorated. The power-sharing government collapsed. We went back to the rhetoric of Greene and Orange and sectarianism, and that affects the politics of the whole island. And if we're going to have a new Ireland, which I really hope we will, truly new Ireland, then we've all got to find it in us to look at the past, to look at what our people did in the past, and not recruit the past as an agent of aggression and division in the present. It just won't do. We've been through enough.
Okay. So it wasn't hard then, with your background, to predict that you'd become a journalist. But why did you then choose you joined your local newspaper, which you speak very fondly, and it speaks very fondly of you, by the way. I've had a look. And you went through RTE, and then you came to the BBC in, I think, 1989 or something. But then you became a foreign and then a war correspondent. Now, how was that predictable, or just something that you just fell into?
Well, you are an eminent psychiatrist.
You're an eminent flatterer.
Flatterist.
Yeah, go on.
And I think the roots are there in, if I go back to a number of factors in childhood, everything is there in childhood. Firstly, I grew up in a very dysfunctional home. It was a home marred by alcoholism and then family breakup. It was a place in which anything could happen very suddenly. And I developed a second sense for reading people and reading situations, for dealing with sudden eruptions of anger, and of knowing how to keep myself safe, knowing how to negotiate very difficult and sometimes dangerous situations. And that became hardwired into me. Along with that, I grew up with a fascination for literature that was given to me by both of my parents. A love of words and a love of the wider world. Neither of them were locked into that claustrophobic, clerical state of Ireland in the 1960s. They were people of the theatre. There were people who, one of my fonder memories of my parents is of watching them rehearse a play together. It was Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and just seeing the play of words across the room between them. And I think those that combination of factors turned me into somebody who was probably, as I say, hardwired for being a foreign correspondent and a war correspondent. I instinctively knew how to react when I was in dangerous places. And I sought that danger again and again. Was I what you call a war junkie? No, I don't think it was as simple as that. I think that's too simplistic a kind of label. I was always fascinated by the history of the places that I was in. I wasn't fascinated by the potential for violence, but I certainly knew how to handle myself in those situations of violence.
And your parents split up when you were 10, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
And it was not, as they say, a civilized breakup.
No, I mean, and I think it was profoundly traumatic. I speak only for myself. Mm-hmm. And I think one carries that. There's a kind of grief and a sadness that follows with that. And you can spend the rest of your life trying to make sense of that and trying to analyze how it affects your own behavior. And that has been my challenge, certainly as a human being, if not as a journalist.
But you said a moment ago that everything is there in childhood. But in your case, that's not entirely true, because other things also happen to you.
Yes, I mean, I think that the sort of formation of the basic personality.
Yes.
You'd agree with me, happens.
Yes, I think we would agree with that bit. Yeah, we would.
There are critical interventions which take place, which
but
can make a difference between me, which made the difference between me being a complete ass, okay, and going off the rails, and in the desperate attention seeking of my teens in particular. And actually taking all of my kind of neurosis and my emotions and the anger and all of the stuff that you come out of a childhood like that as part of your baggage, taking that and making it into something creative.
I noticed you managed to get expelled from school at one stage.
I suspended 3 times, and I should have been expelled.
Oh, right. I thought you were. Okay.
Should have been expelled for good, but I had the most amazing headmaster, a visionary, a man called Brother Jerome Kelly, who came from a very poor part of West Cork, and then went as a missionary to the West Indies at the time of decolonization, and came back and came to our school. And I went to a school it was a private school. It was noted for its privilege. It was always said that the cream of Cork went there, the rich and the thick. And he came, Jerome Kelly came and took a look at this and decided to give us a social conscience. And he did this by sending us out into the poor parishes where the elderly were living in appalling conditions at the time, on a weekly basis to visit people, and then putting us to the work of raising funds to build them new houses. He did this by introducing a television studio into the school, where we learned, how to conduct interviews. I had my first radio experience on Irish radio as a consequence of this. He was ferociously pushy, so he was always getting his boys onto the local radio stations and onto TV if he possibly could. And of course, he introduced us to All Ireland debating, and that was where I learned a certain fluency, not always hitched to the facts, as some of my more
you seem to have done okay.
More kind of rigorous opponents figured out. But I think basically he taught me self-discipline. He taught me the value of work. And he certainly instilled in me a powerful social conscience.
And that's going to be put to the test in ways that you could not have foreseen. You go to South Africa as a correspondent. You're there for the Mandela. You're there for the tribal violence, township violence. And then in 1994, you come to Rwanda. And I think this is a formative experience for you. I'm not going to go into detail of what actually happened there. You wrote Rivers of Blood, which I have here. Which an astonishing book. You did a panorama, Journey into Darkness, which has won prizes. You won the Orwell Prize for that. And we know where we are. The first line of your book begins, "This was a country of corpses, and orphans, and terrible absences. This was where the spirit withered." Now, I don't want to take you back there. I want really, if we can jump 10 years ahead from that, when you go back to Rwanda and you go and you interview some of the murderous militia, the Interahamwe leaders who carried out a hideous massacre at, was it Nurabai? Nurabai, that's it. And several thousand Tutsis, which you had come to when the bodies were still there on the ground. Like the Nazis, who at least tried to get rid of their bodies. The Interahamwe didn't. But you met some of the killers and you interviewed them. Tell us about that.
Yes, I have always been fascinated by motivation. I think it is too easy to look at horrific events and believe that they've been carried out by monsters or by evil people. Now, there are certainly people who are capable of monstrous acts. There are people who are capable of committing evil acts. But in my experience of conflict, the number of people whom I would characterize as being, classic psychopaths or people devoid of empathy, they're very, very few. They're really, really few. The people who worry me are the people like you and me. In other words, ordinary people, okay? The people who, because of social conditioning, because of economic conditionings, because of political messaging, because of brainwashing, because of growing up in a dictatorial one-party system, because of generations of quite deliberate ethnic stereotyping and creation and deepening of mistrust by a powerful state. These and using memory and using history, and very frequently distorting history to create hatred. It's the people who can be turned into killers by their governments, who can be turned into killers in the case of Rwanda, not just by the government, but by the fact that there was a civil war taking place prior to the genocide, which massively elevated people's sense of fear. And it's the creation of a system in which a message is repeated again and again. It is augmented by the presence of paramilitary forces, of militias, of police, of the nation's own army. And it becomes a genocidal project. And the thing that struck me about the people I'd met who spoke to me of the awful things that they did was just their ordinariness. They were farmers, truck drivers, bar owners, teachers. And there was, in many of them, there was just still a sense of shock, because it was as if they'd come out of this madness and suddenly into an utterly different environment. And they were now looking back. There was a man who we met, and he was at home. He'd served his prison sentence, and he'd come out, and he was sitting at home with a wife and a child. And he described to us how he and another man had chased a Tutsi boy into a banana grove and beaten him, and then buried him in a shallow grave. And they'd noticed that he was moving again under the earth. It was quite a shallow grave. He described to me how they'd then gone back in to finish him off, club him until he was finally dead in the ground. And as he was describing this to me, I sensed he was like a man in a state of shock. Couldn't quite believe what he was telling me. And that was striking. So was the kind of banality of some of what people said. I spoke to one man who said, well, and I think he was probably in the kind of, in the psychopath territory, because he said he'd been a pretty notorious killer and had recruited a lot of other people into the genocidal project. But he said, look, the government, I own trucks, and the government promised me a whole new set of tires and parts for my trucks if I took part in this. So it seemed like the right thing to do, essentially. And you're sitting there, can I believe this? And sadly, yes. There are many different motivations, but it is the kind of atmosphere which is created by powerful men. What Primo Levi, the Holocaust survivor, called monsters with beautiful words. Those who tell people that if you just get rid of the Tutsis, you get rid of the Jews, you get rid of the Muslims, whatever, then you will live in a world without enemies. It will be perfect.
You said twice there, you used the phrase they were ordinary people. And I don't know if that was deliberate, but you said remind me of Christopher Browning, the historian who'd written Ordinary Men.
Brilliant book.
It is a fabulous isn't quite the word, but it's a stunning book on how a bunch of Hamburg policemen, not ardent Nazis at all, working class men from Altona in the Hamburg area, go to Poland in 1942, and then as a battalion carry out hideous atrocities. And yet the purpose of the book is that they were ordinary men, and in how the pressures of peer group and of the moral norms that had changed had forced them or brought them to this position of committing mass murder, even though they had the options not to, but they did. And that had just come out 2 years before Rwanda. I was wondering if you had read it at that time.
Yeah, I did. I read it. I read it before. I read it shortly after it came out. A very, very striking book. And the description, which echoed for me after Rwanda, was, and you'll remember this from the Browning book, of men committing massacres and then coming out and being given lots of alcohol.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was quite telling. men drowning themselves in alcohol, the more brutal as they became.
And indeed, even then, the German, the Holocaust genocide had to become, in a way, more clean. That they couldn't maintain that degree of killing. They went on to industrial killing, in gas chambers, etc. But the Rwandan killing was brutality on an unimaginable scale, and in a really short time. It was unbelievably close.
That's correct.
Yeah.
There was the horrifying thing about it. You do see some parallels, for example, in Lithuania, and in the Baltics, where groups of men armed with clubs and machetes were brought to where Jews had been gathered into a square and then set about them in that very intimate kind of hand.
Yeah. That was in Kaunas. I was actually there a few weeks ago.
Oh, really?
And in fact, yes, the German higher authorities disapproved of it because it was too brutal. And anyway,
there is, but it is that intimacy, the terrible intimacy of killing people. Very often it was people they knew. They knew. Now you do find again echoes of that in if you read any of the literature of pogroms. Not just in the Nazi era, but of course prior to it in the Tsarist era. It is people killing people they knew, taking things from people they've long resented or been taught to resent. And that was certainly true on a mass scale in Rwanda.
Now, I have to ask you, because it's very clear from your writings that you didn't emerge unscathed from this. And in Season of Blood, written shortly after, I want to quote a phrase that you wrote, because I think it's quite beautiful. And this is 1996 now you're writing, how you found it difficult to sleep. And you said, I reach for the off switch, but in the darkness cannot find it. That's a very powerful evocation of what I assume is some of the emotional reactions that you are starting to experience to what you'd seen.
I've often sort of had this image in my head of there being this hard drive, which is full of the horror, and wishing there was a way of wiping it clean. And it is only through a long, exhaustive process of therapy with, some pretty wonderful people, that I've learned you don't wipe it clean. You can't. It's part of who I am. It's part of what's made me. The best I do is learn to live with it. I learn to live with it. You cannot just wipe out what you've witnessed. You can't. It's not possible. And you try as best you can by trying to have a happy life, to mitigate the effects of witness.
You talked also, you've had some experience in therapy with our soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan as well.
Yes, indeed. And it's, it's different if you're a journalist. I would say that you don't have a gun to shoot, so you don't have to kill anybody. You don't have to kill anybody, but neither are you able to protect yourself. And there are memories of my time in Rwanda where I remember one particular incident where we were driving down a road and an ambush was being laid, and we saw the people right in front of us down the road, and hearing the one guard that we had with us click on his bayonet, and that sound ever since, the sound of a bayonet being fixed, is just, it sends chills through me. But the other thing, of course, is that soldiers have to keep going. There is a point as a journalist when you can pull back. I've been in places where I've said to myself and my team, this is just too dangerous. We've got to pull back. But I've watched the soldiers keep going forward, and sometimes it was some of them were almost certainly going to be killed. There's that, but then there's the times when you get caught in the middle of something and there's no way out of it. The shells are landing around you and you've just got to lie down and wait till it stops and hope it stops before a shell lands on you. And that stuff is terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. I don't have steel nerves. I'm terrified of incoming artillery, of airstrikes, of snipers. You know, I don't get any buzz whatsoever of being around that stuff. It's deeply challenging.
How do you think how did you manage to, in fact, function for as long? I mean, you said earlier this year that you were taking a break from the BBC because of post-traumatic stress disorder. But how did you function during all those years, Fergal, with the things going on inside you?
Because I was mad as a box of frogs.
Yeah, well, you obviously aren't that. But I mean, sorry, I mean.
I go back. I was hardwired for it. You know, that's the best explanation I can give you. I'm at the moment working on a book on post-traumatic stress disorder. So when I get to the end of it, I'll know.
One of Anya Harar has just asked about yourself. This is, I think, coming to your kind of sins of omission, you might call it. How responsible do you feel when you're, reporting these things? Have you ever walked away and regretted it, or felt that you wish to have discovered the story at an earlier stage? I mean, I think it's about how responsible do you feel for the things that you're witnessing and can't stop.
That's one of the things that I've worked on in therapy, is that responsible for a genocide, that you're responsible for massacre or for famine. It really is. Because you will never carry that weight. That's massively destructive. You have to accept that you do the best you can. But it's not me that created the genocide in Rwanda, or famine in Sudan, or war in the Middle East. I didn't make those things. I witnessed them. I tried to tell the truth of them as best I could, but with all the imperfections of a journalist under great pressure in a dangerous place. But
when you interviewed Don McMullins recently, the great war photographer, he talked about, you quote him as suppressing emotion when he was working. He said that to you, he said, "You can't focus with tears in your eyes." I think it's an amazing way of putting it. Were you able to do the same?
Sometimes and sometimes not. You know, and if you don't cry, it goes somewhere. You know, the emotion goes somewhere. I think it's a blessing for people who are able to express emotion. It really is.
I think you do it very profoundly in your writing, if I'm being honest with you, Fergal. I find it very moving.
Maybe that's how I do it, you know. I kind of I do it through the telling of stories and through writing. And I find a great relief in writing, you know. I really do. A lot of people say they hate the act of writing. I don't. I love it. I really love it. It's where I'm able to express myself best.
Let's go full circle then to where we started with you in one of our leading hospitals at the front line, as they say. Several of us who work in this area supporting staff at the moment are worried that many of the people on that front line are themselves being severely stressed and will suffer some consequences. Some of it may be PTSD, but we think there's another dimension, that they're in a situation we've not been in before, trying to deliver care in inadequate situations where you don't have enough equipment, where you don't have enough staff. And you know, last January you would have done better, next January you'll do better, but now you can't do as well as you should. And we call this a kind of moral injury, which we got from the military. Do you feel that you've suffered then from Rwanda and the other things?
I really understand that, the concept of moral injury. And yeah, of course, there have been places, you know, where I've been and I've walked away because it was too dangerous for me to stay. I felt if I stayed, I was going to get killed. But you know, that comes with you. It goes with you, that pain. Mm-hmm. To remember people, to remember the faces of people you walked away from. That's not an easy thing. And I look now at I mean, I would say that I always had a choice about everything I did, okay? And it's, I made a choice to do the kind of journalism that I did. I made a choice to go to the places I went to. In saying that, I never expected Rwanda to be the way it was. I just had no idea what I was facing. But if you're a healthcare professional dealing with this current pandemic, it is your job to go every day into the front line of this crisis. People will deal with it in different ways. I was chatting to somebody in hospital yesterday about it who raised this very issue. And I said that one of the things that struck me was the extraordinary camaraderie that there existed between nurses, doctors. And around this, I have a cousin who's a consultant in Cork who's dealing with this at Cork University Hospital. And all of the kind of, the normal distinctions and hierarchies seem to me to have been largely suspended. There really is a sense of everybody being in this together. Now, maybe some people in hospitals in different places will tell me I'm wrong, but I do sense a kind of a sense of equality, a sense of shared struggle and burden and common purpose that is unlike anything I've witnessed anywhere in the world previously. And that may help people, as they try to come to terms with the things that they are seeing, with the lives that they cannot save.
Peter Borg, who from his name must be Maltese, I think, has says that you're very good at expressing, but you're also very good at silences. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Silence is essential. Beckett.
I should have guessed.
He's right in the sense that, for example, I'll give, in pure professional terms, if you're interviewing somebody and they are a particularly difficult customer, a dictator, somebody exceptionally unpleasant and who really doesn't want to give much away, I think, and I actually learned this in therapy, the silence that's left to hang just there, it astonishes me the number of times that very powerful people or people who are incredibly, very often brutal people and who are used to exerting their power, how uncomfortable they can be made by a hanging silence. Or people who've got something to hide, and they will then stumble into saying something simply because they're embarrassed by the silence, because they're not in control of that situation. And in order to try and regain some control or sort of position in the conversation, they will say something they didn't intend to say. The other thing is, in terms of writing for television, I think less is more. The use of silences can be immensely creative because you're allowing people to think about what they're seeing. You really let them take in what it is that's in front of them. The words should merely be an aid to the pictures that are in front of you.
I'm tempted to ask, when you finally leave the BBC, do you think you'll find a career as a therapist yourself? I'll do your job, and I think you'd be rather good.
I think it will be many years before I'm declared fully sane.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Okay. Now, we have one other question. Is this that? Now, you were growing up in Ireland in the 1960s. You clearly were schooled by priests, and so what role does religion play in your life?
I mean, I was fortunate in that the kind of people who taught me in secondary school were of a very liberal kind of Catholic persuasion. With the focus on that had a lot to do with the fact that he'd come back from the kind of the missions in a period of decolonization, and so there was no great stress on dogma. It was a very liberal vision of Catholicism. I wouldn't say, you often hear people say, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, and I'm going, well, what on earth does that mean? And I am still Catholic, but it's not the Catholicism of, what one poet memorably described as the clergy cluttered south in Ireland. I'm sort of, I'm a mix of a lot of things, to be honest with you. That's the good thing about getting old, is you can indulge your vagueness.
I think you told someone one of your favourite writers was Graham Greene. Which,
indeed. Indeed. Yeah, I'm probably a Greenist Catholic.
That's a new one.
The Greene is Catholic. You know, those lines where he said, where in The Quiet American, the journalist is asked, you know, do you believe in God? He said, God. He said, God is for the leader writers. I'm a reporter.
Yes, and a relevant book to what we've been talking about. So I think we're coming to our end, but as I say, don't go away at this point, because we've had one more request, which I'll put to you in a second. But I do obviously want to thank you for agreeing to this interview. I know you're still working and you're still preparing, I presume it'll be for tomorrow, your views from the front line of where we are at the moment. And to those who are listening, can I thank you all also for supporting the RSM in our work, which is more important than ever before, and to support us again by joining next week, when I guess then will be historian extraordinaire Andrew Roberts. We'll be talking on leadership in the time of COVID. And given that he's just written a book on Churchill and is now writing one on King George, I think we will have both the best and the worst of that. Now, before we go though, I had a request earlier today from Nicola Fear, who I think is one of my colleagues actually, and who asked, said, could I ask you, Fergal, to end by reading the passage from Benedictus, the Book of Blessings, John O'Donoghue.
Above.
You've got it, good man.
Give me 2 seconds. Amuse yourself, please, class.
Okay, all right. Okay. You're going to find it. But this is what you read on the Stay program. Someone else has actually they've asked about a little bit more about your choice of poetry and fiction. So I don't know if you want to ad lib whilst you're looking for it.
Indeed, when I'm talking about that, I mean, I'm an avid reader of poetry. It's one of my great consolations. And it has definitely helped to keep me sane. I'm also a great lover of fiction. I'm in the middle of Hilary Mantel's final episode of the Cromwell story at the moment. I don't know how the rest of you are finding it. It's a challenging book. A lot of yes. A lot to stay with. But she's just such a brilliant writer. Her book on the French Revolution, A Place of Greater Safety, is one of the great classics. So bear with me while I scroll down here.
I can also be listening. The Anton Lesser is reading it at the moment, which you can get on iPlayer, and does a fantastic job of that as well. And, it works very well. And I think they're repeating the TV series, aren't they? The first two books have been shown again. So one of the things in the time of COVID, you can catch up with all the things you haven't been able to do.
I don't know how many of you are managing to do lots and lots of things during this quarantine. I'm not. I'm as busy as I ever was. In fact, probably busier. I don't sit well. It doesn't suit me well to be sitting still, and that's probably something I really do need to work on.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think that's
as I scroll frantically down here.
Yes.
Any second now. Here we go.
So
here we go. Here I have it. Okay.
Excellent. So I'm now going to hand over to you to read us out with the poem John O'Donoghue that you use on the Today programme to amazing effect. Fergal.
This is the time to be slow. Lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginning. Thank you all, and good night.